The metal bucket sat at the base of a dead white oak at the corner of a family's south pasture for over 60 years. It was set there each evening before dark, filled with kitchen scraps and sometimes with raw meat from the week's butchering, and by morning it was always empty and moved to a specific spot between two exposed roots of the tree. The same spot every time. In it, centered between the roots, in the same orientation every time. The family in the farmhouse knew what was taking the food. Their neighbors knew. The handful of households in that hollow above the dry fork of the Cheat River in Tucker County, West Virginia, had known for decades. They called it what it was. They called it a Dogman, and they had been feeding it deliberately, carefully, and with full knowledge of what they were feeding, since the summer of 1953. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. Tucker County, West Virginia sits in the upper Cheat River watershed, folded into the Allegheny Highlands on the eastern edge of the state. The county covers 419 square miles of mountain terrain, and the majority of that terrain is either Monongahela National Forest or private timberland that functions as forest in practice. The county seat is Parsons, a town of roughly 1,200 people where the Cheat River begins at the confluence of the Dry Fork and the Shavers Fork. If you stand at the bridge over the Cheat in downtown Parsons and look upstream along the Dry Fork, the valley runs southeast into narrowing ridgelines that the National Forest covers wall to wall above the tree line. In a county where the population is around 7,000 people spread across 419 square miles, the forest is never far in any direction. Route 72 runs south from Parsons along the Dry Fork drainage, tracing the creek through a valley that pinches and opens by turns as the ridge walls assert themselves. The road is paved, but badly frost-heaved where the ground freezes deep in winter, and in Tucker County, the ground freezes very deep. The Monongahela National Forest begins at the ridge lines on both sides of the valley, and the boundary between private farm ground and federal wilderness is usually a matter of a few hundred yards of second-growth hardwood between the bottom fields and the ridge crest. The terrain does not invite passage through it. The only reasons people came historically were to cut timber or pull coal from the seams running through the Allegheny front, and both industries had contracted and left before the second half of the 20th century was out. What remained was the land itself, and the families who had been there long enough to have no intention of leaving. The hollows that cut into the ridges above the Dry Fork each contain a handful of households connected to the valley road by gravel approaches the residents maintain themselves. In a hard winter, those gravel roads are the first things to become impassable and the last to be plowed. Communities in those hollows have understood for generations that help from outside is theoretical. The people in your immediate vicinity are the people you will deal with when something goes wrong. This understanding shapes how those communities handle their problems, including the ones that cannot be explained to anyone not already living inside them. The hollow where this story takes place sits 7 miles south of Parsons on the west side of the Dry Fork Valley. A gravel road climbs the hollow's mouth and dead ends about a mile in at the property of a family that has been there since before the First World War. As of 2023, 9 households remained active in that hollow. In the 1940s, there were more than twice that number. The young people left when the employment left, moving to Elkins, Morgantown, Pittsburgh, wherever work could be found. The ones who stayed are the ones with roots deep enough that leaving was never a serious option. They farm small acreage, take contract work when it comes, manage on retirement and disability income, and look after each other the way people look after each other when they understand the alternative is not being looked after. The economy of Tucker County contracted severely across the second half of the 20th century. The coal seams that had supported mines since the 1890s were largely exhausted or uneconomical to work by the 1960s. The timber industry contracted further as mechanization reduced the need for labor crews, and as the Monongahela National Forest boundary expanded to protect much of the remaining merchantable timber on federal land. What replaced those industries was largely nothing. Disability income and Social Security and whatever informal work the local economy could support. The people who left. The people who stayed made the calculation, conscious or not, that what they had in Tucker County was worth more than whatever was available elsewhere. That calculation was partly about land. In a county where families have held the same ground for 100 or 150 years, The land is not simply real estate. It is the accumulation of every decision an extended family has made across generations. The fence lines they ran, the buildings they put up, the fields they cleared, the trees they left standing. Selling it is not an economic transaction in the way that selling a house in a city is an economic transaction. It is a severance, and not everyone is willing or able to make it. The people remaining in the hollow above the dry fork are, by definition, the people who stayed because the land held them, or because the land was what they had, or because leaving would have required giving up something they could not quantify to a realtor. The German and Scots-Irish settlement patterns that shaped Tucker County's founding population left a durable cultural residue. Highland families from the German-speaking regions of Europe found the Allegheny terrain familiar and the isolation manageable, and they brought with them traditions of community, self-reliance, of handling the affairs of a small place within that place, and of maintaining practical knowledge about the landscape passed from one generation to the next, rather than recorded in documents that outsiders might read. That tradition persists, in diluted but recognizable form, in the communities that remain along the Dry Fork drainage today. The woman who agreed to talk set one condition: her real name stays out of it. Not because she is embarrassed by what she knows, and not because she fears disbelief. Tucker County has fewer than 7,000 people, and she has lived there her entire life. In communities that size, certain kinds of attention are more trouble than the truth is worth. We will call her Irene.
Quick thing before we move on. I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Irene is in her late 60s. She spent 32 years teaching 6th and 7th grade English at the county middle school in Parsons, driving those 7 miles each morning and back each evening. 30 years. She knows every turn of that road by now. She retired a few years ago and lives alone in the house where she was born, a white-painted board and batten structure over a fieldstone foundation that her great-grandfather built in the years after the First World War. The land around it, roughly 70 acres of pasture, woodlot, and creek bottom, has been in her family since the clearing. The south corner of the property, where the pasture meets the woodlot, is marked by a white oak that has been dead for 15 years, but has not fallen. That tree is where this story lives. What Irene knows, she learned from her father. What her father knew, he came to by way of a late July evening in 1953, when he went out to check his south pasture fence and found something he had no category for. He was 29 years old that summer. He had come back from Korea 3 years prior. He was farming the property his father had left him, running a small beef herd alongside milk cows, chickens, and a kitchen garden. He was not an excitable man. Tucker County in the early 1950s did not produce or reward excitable men. It produced and rewarded men who were competent in the particular ways required to maintain a working farm in the Allegheny Highlands without reliable access to anything that could not be reached on bad roads in uncertain weather. Irene describes him as precise and contained, a man who spoke exactly as much as the situation required and not a word more. The cattle had been unsettled for 2 days before the evening in question. Irene knows this because it is part of the account her father gave her, told in pieces over the years in the way a parent tells a child things when the child is old enough to absorb them. He had noticed the cattle bunching tighter than usual at the barn end of the pasture, which is what cattle do when a predator is working the area. He had walked the fence line without finding evidence of breach. He had checked the creek bank for tracks without finding anything he recognized. On Thursday evening that week, he walked the fence again after supper, moving along the south wire in the fading light. He found nothing out of order. He turned back toward the house. He swept his flashlight across the pasture out of habit, checking the far end before closing up for the night. The beam hit something at the edge of the woodlot that did not belong there. He described it to Irene the way men describe events they have processed for years, without the original shock, with the clarity that comes when a memory has been examined until what remains is just the fact of it. He said it was standing at the tree line about 60 feet from where he stood, on 2 legs. The proportions above the waist were wrong for any person he had seen. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long, hanging below the level of the hips. The head sat on a thick neck and the face projected forward in a way that a human face does not. A long extension of the skull, a muzzle, distinctly canine in profile even at 60 feet in the failing light. The ears were erect and pointed, set high on the skull. He swept his flashlight across the creature's face, and the eyes caught the beam and returned it amber. He stood there. It stood there. He cannot say how long. Long enough that he thought clearly about what he was looking at, ran through the explanations available to him in 1953 on a farm in Tucker County, West Virginia, and found none of them adequate. A bear, even rearing up, does not have a dog's head. A man, even a large one, does not stand 7 feet tall in a posture that communicates nothing human. The creature turned and walked into the timber on 2 legs, with the unhurried ease of something that had not been disturbed, only observed, and was gone. He came inside. He said nothing that evening. He checked the cattle in the morning, found them intact, and went about his day. He saw it 2 more times over the following week, always at the tree line, always at dusk or after, always watching him with the same steady attention with which he was watching it. The cattle remained tense. The working dogs refused to go out after dark, and they were working dogs, not pets, trained to be outside in all conditions. Their refusal to go out was information. He talked to the neighbor, Les's father, whose family had been in the hollow as long as his own, a Scots-Irish man who did not embellish and did not tolerate embellishment in others. He told him what he had seen. Les's father listened without skepticism. He said his own father had mentioned something in the hollow years back, but he had always taken it for a bear story. He said he had seen something himself 3 winters prior. He described an almost identical figure at the tree line. He said he had fired a shot into the air with a rifle to scare it off, and the thing had not moved. Had stood and watched while the shot echoed up the hollow and then turned and walked into the trees at an unhurried pace as if the noise were no concern of its. The decision Irene's father made was characteristic of the man. He was not going to hunt it. He was not going to call the county sheriff and try to articulate something he could barely articulate to himself. He was not going to move his family off land that had been in his name since his grandfather cleared it. He was going to find the most practical response available to him for the presence of something he could not explain and could not drive off and could not ignore. He left a metal bucket of kitchen scraps at the base of the white oak at the south corner of the pasture. He set it down in the evening before dark and went inside. In the morning, the bucket was empty and had been moved about 8 feet from where he had placed it. He put it out again. By the end of that summer, the cattle had settled. The dogs went outside in the evenings. Whatever the bucket of scraps had communicated to whatever had been watching from the tree line, it had been received. The farm returned to what it had been before, with one addition: a metal container at the corner tree, put out before dark, empty by morning. The neighbor was told within a year. Les's father had watched Irene's father on his evening walks to the corner tree long enough to understand what was happening and to ask directly. The answer was direct. 2 more households in the hollow knew by the mid-1960s, each learning in the same way. They had seen something they needed explained, and the explanation existed and could be shared with people who would handle it correctly. Irene was 8 years old when her parents told her. Her mother handled it the way she handled all serious information, with the calm precision of someone who believed that honest preparation was more useful than protective ignorance. She told her about the bucket and what it was for. She said there was something in the hollow that had been there longer than the family had. She said they left food for it at the corner tree, and it left the farm alone. She said Irene was not to go to the corner tree after dark and not to go into the south woodlot at night. She said as long as those rules were kept, there was nothing to worry about. Irene accepted this the way children accept information delivered by trusted adults in steady tones. She filed it alongside everything else that was true about the hollow. The creek flooding in March, the power failing in ice storms, something coming to the corner tree in the dark. Facts of life in that place. Something to work around, not something to fear. She first saw it herself in the late summer of 1971. She was home from Fairmont State for the month before her 2nd year. Her mother was recovering from knee surgery. Her father was in Parsons on business that ran late. She had been given the bucket for that week. She walked the 50 yards from the house to the corner oak on a Thursday evening with the bucket in her right hand, watching the uneven ground the way she had learned to since turning an ankle there the previous spring. She set the bucket at the base of the tree. She straightened up. It was 30 yards away, at the woodlot edge, in the last usable light of an August evening. She tells this story in a voice that has had 50 years to organize itself, not recounting trauma, recounting something she has long understood but never stopped finding significant. She stood there, and the creature stood there, and she had time, more time than she expected, to register what she was looking at. The height. She knew the corner fence post was standard pasture height. She has since measured it, 5 feet and 2 inches. The creature stood clearly above the top rail, not marginally, by what she estimates at 8 to 10 inches. That put the top of its head at close to 6 feet from the ground. The body extended below that, the trunk proportioned longer than a human trunk, the legs heavy through the thigh and angled slightly forward at the knee in a way that gave the posture a solidity, a sense of readiness, different from the way a person stands. The arms hung below the hip line. Long, more so than any person's arms, clearly distinguishable as arms and not forelegs, hanging in a way that implied full rotational use of the shoulder joint. The fur was dark. In the August dusk, which still had enough light to see by but was losing it fast, the fur looked almost wet, the dense darkness a black Labrador has when it comes out of water, short and close on the face and hands, longer and thicker on the back and across the chest. The face. She said it was a dog's face. Not that it resembled a dog's face. She said it was a dog's face. The snout extended forward from the skull in a way that nothing else extends forward. Long enough that even at 30 yards, in fading light, the canine jaw proportion was unmistakable. The ears stood erect and pointed, set well back on the skull, high. The eyes were oriented forward on the skull, the placement of a predator, and in the last of the August light they returned amber when they caught what remained of it. She put the bucket down without looking away from the creature. She backed toward the house, keeping her face toward the tree line, and went inside. She called her father in Parsons. He listened without interrupting. He said, "Yes." He said, "Welcome to it." He said it had never done anything to anyone in the hollow and she should not expect it to start. It had not, in 20 years, and as far as anyone in that hollow could verify, it would not for another 4 decades after that. The arrangement that had been improvised by a practical man with a flashlight and a bucket of kitchen scraps in 1953 became, over the following years, the operating protocol of a small community. Irene's father managed it until the late 1980s. Les's father managed his side until his death in 1979, after which Les took it up without discussion because it had been his father's responsibility and was therefore his. Irene's mother had participated from the beginning, keeping the bucket filled when her husband was away, treating it with the same practical attention she gave to everything on the property that needed maintaining. When Irene came home permanently after finishing her teaching degree, the management transferred to her gradually, by shared understanding rather than formal handoff. What Irene accumulated over 50 years of paying close attention to the corner tree is a body of observation that no wildlife researcher has been able to compile about this phenomenon, because no wildlife researcher has had 60 years of access to a stable encounter site. She is not a scientist and she does not use scientific language. She describes what she has watched carefully for a long time in the way a person describes such things, plainly, specifically, and without embellishment. The creature was reliable. That word, more than any other, is what she emphasized in every conversation we had. Whatever uncertainty remained about its nature and its range and its specific motivations, it was reliable. It came to the corner tree consistently, not on a predictable schedule. She could not have told you which night of the week it would appear, but she could tell you that in 50 years of filling that bucket, it was never left unemptied for more than 4 or 5 days, unless something had disrupted the supply on the human side of the arrangement. When she or Les or one of the other informed households noticed the bucket sitting full past the usual window, they would check that the food was still fresh. Every such check was followed within a day or two by the container in the root bowl, empty, correctly placed. The placement was the detail she found most striking. Early on, she had assumed the creature dropped the bucket wherever it happened to be when it finished. She noticed over the first few years that it always ended up near the same root, and she thought the physical geography of the roots might account for it, a natural resting point. She began paying more precise attention. The bucket was not falling into the root bowl. It was being placed there. The same orientation each time, the same centering between the roots. She measured the variation across dozens of observations, less than 3 inches in any direction. Whatever placed that container was placing it deliberately, with the same intention on every visit. She asked Les about his container at his property. He confirmed the same pattern, always returned to a specific position relative to the fence post he kept it near, in the same orientation, within inches of the same spot every time. No animal places objects. A raccoon knocks a container over and leaves it where it falls. A bear bats it aside. What Irene and Les documented across decades of consistent observation was a creature that treated a specific spot in its territory as a designated location for a specific transaction, and that maintained that designation with precision over years and years and years. The cattle on Irene's property, in the decades following the establishment of the arrangement, did not display the sustained unease her father had described in that first summer. She raised cattle through the 1980s and 90s, and the animals grazed calmly to the south end of the pasture, within a few hundred feet of where a large predator passed regularly. She has thought about this. Horses and cattle are acutely sensitive to predator scent and proximity in ways that produce visible behavior changes for days. The creature she is describing is capable of killing a deer with a single bite. And the cattle knew it was in the area. She believes they knew. But they were not afraid the way they would be afraid of a bear or a coyote working the field edge. Something in the arrangement had been communicated to the livestock, even if what was communicated cannot be articulated. The most striking single incident in the first 30 years of the arrangement happened in October of 1984. A family farther south in the Hollow, people who had moved in during the 1970s and who were not part of the informed circle, kept chickens and meat rabbits. A coyote got into their rabbit hutches twice in 1 week. They lost 8 animals to 2 raids. The father set a leg-hold trap along the back fence on the 3rd day. The trap was never triggered. On the 4th day, a dead coyote was found at the base of the back fence, not near the trap, at the fence corner, the farthest point of the property from the hutches. The coyote had been killed by a single wound to the back of the neck, the spine severed at the base of the skull. The family vet, when asked about the wound, said the force required was consistent with an animal much larger than anything native to that county. The coyote's body showed no other significant damage. It had been placed at the fence, legs folded under the body, positioned. Irene's father examined the carcass when word reached him. He came home and told Irene what he believed had happened. He said the creature had killed the coyote and left it at their fence. He said, "It left it at their fence because that is their fence. It knows whose property is whose." That interpretation may go beyond what the evidence strictly supports. Irene knows that. She holds it as a considered possibility, not a certainty. But she also notes that in 60 years of the arrangement, no livestock on any of the informed family's properties in the Hollow was ever taken. No chickens vanished overnight. No calves were found down in the south pasture. No rabbits pulled through the wire. The families outside the informed circle experienced the predator pressure that was simply normal for Tucker County. The families inside the arrangement did not. Whether that is cause and effect or coincidence, she cannot say with certainty. The pattern held for 60 years. The circle of knowledge in the Hollow grew slowly and only when it had to. By the late 1980s, 4 households knew. Each new person was told only after demonstrating by encounter or by necessity that they had the practical temperament to use the information without breaking the arrangement that depended on almost no one knowing about it. Irene and Les made these judgments individually and compared notes. The guiding principle was simple. The arrangement works because almost nobody knows about it. Every additional person is a potential point of failure. You kept the circle small. Audrey, who is now in her late 40s, was told when she was in her early 20s, after moving into the Hollow following her marriage. She describes her introduction to the full picture as less a revelation than a clarification. She had grown up near enough to the hollow's edge to know there was something in it that adults spoke about differently than they spoke about bears or coyotes. The formal explanation gave her language for something she had already known was true. The 5 decades from the mid-1950s through the early 2000s were quiet in the way that hollows are quiet when nothing is going wrong. The creek flooded. The power failed. People were born and died and moved away. The coal jobs disappeared by the 80s and the timber work thinned to almost nothing by the 90s, and the hollow contracted year by year to its most essential population. What did not change was the corner tree and the bucket and the container in the root bowl each morning. The arrangement held through hard winters and economic collapses and everything else that came through Tucker County, West Virginia in those years. It held because the people who maintained it treated it as what it was, an obligation to something with legitimate claim to the territory they shared. The behavioral patterns Irene accumulated across 50 years of consistent attention are, taken together, the most complete portrait of Dogman behavior at a stable encounter site that exists outside of academic cryptid research, and most of what exists in that research is not this specific or this sustained. She did not set out to compile a behavioral record. She set out to maintain an arrangement. The record is the byproduct of someone who paid close attention to the same situation for a very long time. The creature was committed to darkness in a way that went beyond nocturnal habit. It operated at night and avoided conditions where it could be observed clearly. In 50 years, Irene knows of 3 instances where it was seen in anything that could be described as daytime conditions. All 3 in the earliest pre-dawn, under heavy cloud cover, in the gray margin where the darkness had technically ended but the light had not yet begun. It appeared briefly at the tree line in those instances, and was gone. Those 3 exceptions underscored rather than contradicted the rule. Its range extended well beyond the hollow. Irene assembled this understanding over years from observations offered by people she trusted in the surrounding area. A family that kept horses 2 miles south along the Dry Fork Valley mentioned, at different times a decade apart, that their horses had refused to settle on certain fall nights without apparent cause. A hunter who worked the timber lease east of the hollow showed Les a photograph of tracks in the snow along a creek bed on the upper slope. The tracks were large, canid in general structure, with a stride length and lateral spacing the hunter said he could not account for from any animal he knew in Tucker County. He had convinced himself they were elk tracks distorted by partial thaw. Les looked at the photographs and said nothing. He had seen tracks matching that description for 30 years. The vocalization was the evidence that most affected people who heard it, because it could not be rationalized away the way a dark shape at a tree line can be rationalized as a shadow or a bear on hind legs. Les heard it first, in the winter of 1977, at 2 or 3 in the morning, waking from a sound that came through the walls of his house and registered in his chest before he was fully conscious. He described it as lower than any dog he had ever owned or worked around. Not a howl, and not a bark, but something that used the lower resonant register of both without resolving into either. It lasted several seconds, and had a pattern. It rose and fell in a way that Les said reminded him, oddly and uneasily, of a person calling a long word very slowly. It occurred twice that night with about 40 minutes between instances, and then stopped. Irene has heard it 8 or 9 times in 50 years. She began tracking when it occurred and noticed, across several instances, that it concentrated in the October to December window. She developed the theory, which she holds carefully, that the vocalizations mark territorial boundaries at the time of year, when large predators are most actively competing for resources, and when the edges of territories are most subject to testing. She acknowledges this is interpretation. It is what a careful observer concludes over sufficient time. The broader research on Dogman encounters, compiled most systematically by Linda Godfrey across 3 decades of work spanning the Great Lakes and the Appalachian regions, identifies behavioral patterns consistent across hundreds of independent witnesses who had no contact with each other. Nocturnal, territorial rather than predatory in orientation toward humans, associated with major waterways, ridgelines, and genuine wilderness, capable of coordinated behavior suggesting social structure. What Irene describes fits this profile, and the dry fork of the Cheat River is exactly the terrain that profile would predict. A major cold water drainage running through 900,000 acres of Monongahela National Forest, remote, with minimal and shrinking human presence. The historical record for a presence in this specific valley reaches back past any living memory in the hollow. Tucker County was settled primarily by Scots, Irish, and German immigrants beginning in the late 1700s. German immigrant communities in the Allegheny Highlands brought with them a folk tradition of acknowledging and propitiating powerful territorial presences in forested areas. Folklorists working in the region in the early 20th century documented this tradition and noted that the people who maintained it understood it as practical rather than supernatural. The accumulated knowledge of communities that had lived alongside something real and worked out how to manage the coexistence. Acknowledge the presence, maintain a defined relationship with it, and the territory can be shared. Disrupt the relationship, and the territory cannot. Before European settlement, the Upper Cheat River watershed was within the range of the Shawnee and of hunting parties from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, particularly the Seneca, who claimed hunting territories extending from western New York into the Allegheny drainages of Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia. Early American surveyors who worked the Upper Cheat drainage in the late 1700s recorded that Shawnee guides sometimes declined to enter specific tributaries at certain times of year, offering explanations that the Europeans recorded as superstitious and moved past. Read together. Those accounts describe people who understood specific territories to be occupied by presences that warranted managed relationships rather than confrontation, and who communicated this through behavioral protocols that Europeans observed without comprehending. Whether Irene's great-great-grandmother brought a German folk understanding of forest presences with her when she came to Tucker County, or whether her father reinvented an equivalent protocol in the summer of 1953 through pure pragmatic observation, is a question she cannot answer. What she can say is that the approach that worked for 60 years in that hollow is consistent with what human beings in a variety of cultural and historical contexts have found to work when they share territory with something that requires acknowledgement. If you have spent any time in Tucker County or driven Route 72 along the Dry Fork Valley, you know the kind of country I am describing. The ridge walls close in on both sides. The Monongahela National Forest starts at the ridgeline and goes for miles in every direction. In the evenings in September and October, when the light drops and the fog comes down off the national forest into the valley, that stretch of road becomes something different from what it is in daylight. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen out there, or anywhere in the hollows of Tucker County, because based on what I have been going through, the Dry Fork drainage has seen far more activity than anyone has put on an official record. The winter of 2014 was when the arrangement was most severely tested in the decades before it was deliberately ended. The polar vortex that settled over much of eastern North America in January of that year hit Tucker County as hard as anywhere in the region. The temperature in the Dry Fork Valley dropped to readings that broke records. The creek froze solid from bank to bank. Route 72 was closed by drifts. The county did not have equipment to address quickly, and the gravel roads into the hollows were not plowed until the valley road was clear. The hollow above the Dry Fork was cut off for 11 days. Irene had influenza for much of that period. Not severely enough to need hospitalization, but sick enough that going out to the corner tree in temperatures well below zero was not something her body could manage. The corner tree was 50 yards from the back door of the house, across a pasture buried in drifts that were waist-high in the low spots. She did not have snowshoes. Les was managing his own property a quarter-mile up the blocked road, unable to reach Irene's corner tree even if he had been inclined to try. The feeding stopped. Not by decision, by circumstance. Audrey had come to Irene's house on the second day of the storm, before the road became completely impassable because a fallen tree had blocked her own hollow's access, and Irene was sick and could not manage the house alone. She stayed through the entire period. She managed the fire, the well pump, the cooking, everything that needed doing while Irene recovered. The corner tree and its bucket went unattended. 9 days into the 11-day cold snap, at 5:40 in the morning, Audrey got up to use the bathroom. She came out of the bathroom and went into the kitchen. The kitchen window faced the backyard. She went to the window because there was a faint ambient glow from the snow covering the yard, the kind of glow that snow makes when it reflects even the weakest pre-dawn light, and there was an interruption in that glow. A shape, dark against the white, at the base of the porch steps. The porch steps are 12 feet from the kitchen door. The corner tree is 50 yards from the same door. The creature was not at the corner tree. It was not at the tree line. It was not at the edge of the pasture. It was at the bottom of the porch steps, which is where you stand when you intend to knock. Audrey describes what she saw with the steadiness of someone who has told the story enough times that the initial shock has been separated from the memory, and what remains is the information. The creature was standing at the base of the steps. It was looking at the house. The posture was the same as every description she had ever heard from the people who had seen it at the tree line over the previous decades. Upright, balanced, attentive. The ambient glow of the snow and the early false dawn was enough to establish the scale. The outline of the head, the ears, the arms that hung below the hip line. She estimates she watched it for between 60 and 90 seconds, though she acknowledges her ability to measure time accurately in those 90 seconds was probably not reliable. Then it moved. It walked to the right side of the porch, to the corner where the railing met the yard fence. It stood there briefly. Then it went over the fence in a single fluid motion that cleared the top rail without visible effort, and it walked toward the woodlot with the unhurried pace that everyone who has seen it always describes. Within 10 seconds, the shape was gone into the trees. Audrey woke Irene. She said, "Come to the kitchen window and look at the yard." The yard was empty. From the base of the porch steps to the fence and over the fence to the tree line, the snow held tracks. 2 parallel lines of large impressions, widely spaced, the spacing and depth consistent with something much heavier than any person and moving on 2 legs. The depth of the impressions in hard-packed snow that Audrey's own footprints barely marked suggested a weight that she does not try to estimate, large enough that the snow registered it clearly while barely registering her. Irene stood at the kitchen window and looked at those tracks for a long time. Then she said they should not go outside that day. They did not go outside. When the roads opened 11 days after the storm had begun, she went to the corner tree with 2 full buckets. Both were emptied within 2 days. The containers were in the root bowl, in the spots between the roots, in the correct orientations. The community processed the porch visit quietly. Les knew. Audrey knew. It was not discussed with anyone else, and Audrey's husband was not told because he was not yet part of the informed circle. Irene turned the event over in her mind for the 3 years that followed. She arrived at what she calls a clarification, rather than a new conclusion. She had always understood the creature to be capable of approaching the house if it chose to. The corner tree was 50 yards from the back door. The distance was not a barrier. What the distance had been, in 60 years of the arrangement, was a choice. The creature's choice to stay at the tree line was the behavioral form of the arrangement, the same way the bucket at the corner tree was the human form of it. The 2 sides maintained their respective positions because the arrangement made those positions meaningful. When the arrangement lapsed for 9 days, the creature's position changed. It came to where the people were, because the established communication point had gone silent, and it came to find out why. That is not how a wild animal responds to a depleted food source. A wild animal finds another food source. What Audrey had watched at the porch steps was an inquiry, a check on a relationship. That recognition sat in Irene for 3 years before anything disrupted the arrangement permanently. The disruption came from outside the hollow, in the form of a plumber from Elkins. Her younger daughter married him in 2009. Good man, hardworking. He moved into the hollow with her in 2016, when housing in Elkins became too expensive, and Irene's daughter wanted to be closer to her mother. Irene told her daughter the full account before they moved in. Her daughter had grown up adjacent to the knowledge the way children in that hollow grew up with it, knowing the shape of a thing without having all its edges. The full picture was not a shock. Her husband was a different situation. He was told there was a large animal that came to the corner tree periodically, that the family had found it easier to leave food for it than to deal with the problems that arose when they did not, and that the less attention paid to it, the better. This partial version was all Irene was prepared to give him at that point. She had spent decades developing good judgment about who received the full version and when, and a man who had recently arrived from Elkins was not yet in the right position to receive it. She watched him for several months. She assessed him as practical and steady, not given to impulsive action. She thought he would be ready for the complete picture within a year or two. She was probably right about that. She did not have a year. He saw it in October of 2017. He was coming home from a job in Parsons on a Tuesday evening, past 8 o'clock. Route 72, south of Parsons in mid-October after 8 in the evening, is dark in the way that roads are dark when they run between ridge walls that block any ambient light from a town 7 miles north, and there is nothing but forest on both sides. He came around the last curve before the Hollow's gravel road junction, and something was crossing the road about 100 yards ahead of him. He braked. He watched it cross. He described it the next morning to Audrey in terms she recognized immediately. Large, moving on 2 legs, covering the road width in fewer strides than any person would need. A head that was not a human head. A face that projected forward in a way that faces do not project. It crossed the road and went into the tree line on the far side and was gone. He was steady in the telling. He was not a man who frightened easily. He said it clearly, and then said he wanted to call the county animal control. Audrey talked him out of it that night. She told him the full version, which she had the authority to do given the circumstances, and she told him why calling anyone was exactly what the Hollow needed to avoid. He was not hostile and not incredulous. He was a man integrating information that recontextualized everything he understood about where he had moved his family, and he handled it with the steadiness she had seen him apply to other difficult information. He asked questions. He got straight answers. He said he would not call anyone. He called the Game Commission 3 days later from a parking lot in Parsons after finishing a job and reported an unknown large animal crossing Route 72 south of Parsons. He had not planned to, Irene believes. She thinks the call happened the way calls like this happen. Alone in a parking lot with time to think, phone in hand, and something he had seen sitting in the front of his mind large enough to override the conversation with Audrey. He did not tell the officer what he had actually seen. He said a large, unknown animal had crossed the road. The officer asked if it might have been a bear. He said he did not think so, but possibly. The officer said they would send someone. A Game Commission vehicle was parked at the Hollow's road junction for about 45 minutes the following Thursday. The officer walked the road shoulder in the gravel. He knocked on one door in the Hollow, which was not Irene's. He found nothing. 2 days of rain had fallen between the sighting and the visit. He filed his report and left. The impact of the visit was not the visit itself. The impact was what the visit represented. A state vehicle, a knock on a door, a record, however thin, that something unusual had been reported from that section of road. A record that could serve as the starting point for further inquiry, if anyone in the Game Commission chose to follow it. The arrangement had survived for 65 years, without leaving a mark on any official document. That clean record was now slightly compromised. Irene called the informal meeting. The informed households. Her kitchen table on a Friday evening. She laid out what had happened. The sighting, the call, the visit. She said what everyone in the room was already thinking. One call from someone who did not know what he was calling about could be managed. A second call, from the same stretch of road, from someone with more specific information, or a photograph, or a description detailed enough to intrigue the right person in the right office, could not be managed the same way. The Hollow's ability to maintain the arrangement depended entirely on remaining invisible to the agencies and outside institutions that would respond to it in exactly the ways the community could not accommodate. Les said he understood the argument. He also said he was afraid of a different thing. He said he had been trying to remember, since Irene called the meeting, whether the bucket had ever gone unfilled for more than a week, and what had happened when it had. He told the room about the polar vortex winter and what Audrey had seen at the porch steps. He asked the room to hold that in mind before deciding. The room held it in mind. Irene said what she had come to the meeting prepared to say. She said the porch visit in 2014 was part of her reason for reaching this conclusion, not a reason against it. The visit had not been threatening. She did not believe the creature was dangerous to the people of the Hollow. 65 years of evidence supported that conclusion. But the visit had established something she had not been able to set aside. It had shown her that the spatial understanding maintained by the arrangement, the creature at the tree line, and the people inside the house, was a choice the creature made within the arrangement, and not a fixed boundary independent of it. If the arrangement ended permanently, she believed the creature would move its territory and leave the hollow, but she was not certain of that. And the period between the arrangement ending and the creature's response becoming clear was a period she was not prepared to manage, while also managing the attention from the Game Commission report. The decision to stop was unanimous, or near enough. The bucket at the corner tree was filled for the last time in the second week of November, 2017, and not filled again. The winter of 2017 to 2018 passed without obvious incident in the hollow itself. The corner tree stood at the south corner of the pasture with nothing at its base. The woodlot was quiet. Whatever had been at the tree line in the evenings was no longer visible there. The community waited. The incidents that followed did not come to the hollow. They spread out from it. In March of 2018, a chicken coop at the southern end of the hollow, a property not in the informed circle, was raided. 2 birds were killed and left in the run. The wounds on both birds were clean and precise, inconsistent with a coyote's chaotic kill pattern, and too large to have been made by a weasel. The family reinforced the coop and saw no further losses. Irene heard about the chickens. She said nothing. In April, a man who ran the gravel roads along the Dry Fork for exercise posted a photograph to a Tucker County outdoors group on social media. The photograph showed a section of soft mud along a drainage ditch near the Valley Road, 1.5 miles south of the hollow's junction. He said he had never seen tracks like this in 20 years of running rural roads in Tucker County and asked if anyone could identify them. The tracks were large, canid in general structure, with a stride length and separation he noted seemed wrong for any animal he knew. The post received 11 comments suggesting a large dog or a dispersing wolf. The photograph was not sharp enough to settle anything. The post was forgotten within 10 days. Irene saw the post. She recognized the approximate location. She said nothing. In July, a woman who trail ran the Forest Service roads on the ridge east of the hollow posted to her personal social media that she had seen something on the ridge road that she could not categorize and did not want to go back past. She described it as large and upright. She did not say more in the post. She received jokes and skepticism from her followers. She did not engage further. That ridge road was well above the drainage where the creature had always operated. The Dry Fork Valley floor, the lower slopes, the hollow, and its woodlot. Those were the areas where 65 years of evidence placed its territory. The ridge crest above the hollow was outside the established range, or what Irene had understood as the established range. Les said what she was thinking. He said the creature was moving. He said it was ranging into areas it had not used before, looking for whatever the arrangement had provided it with. He said he did not think it was looking for the food. He said it could find food anywhere in the Mon National Forest. He said what it was looking for was the acknowledgement. The arrangement had provided something beyond the physical content of a bucket of scraps. It had provided a defined relationship with the human inhabitants of a territory the creature considered its own. Without the defined relationship, it was testing where the new boundaries were. Les told Irene that fall that what they had done in November sat on him the way breaking a promise sits on a person. He knew it was not a promise in any conventional sense. He knew the creature had not signed anything, and could not have consented to anything in terms any lawyer or philosopher would recognize. He said it felt like a promise anyway. He said he had run fence lines and honored handshakes and paid debts his whole life, and walking away from the arrangement after 65 years felt like walking away from a debt. He was 73 years old that fall, and had maintained his side of the feeding since his father's death in 1979. He was not a sentimental man. Irene says the fact that he said this, given the kind of man he was, is the part she thinks about most when she looks back on that period. Irene restarted the feeding in January of 2019. She made the decision alone, without calling a meeting. She went to the corner tree on a Saturday afternoon in the first week of January, the first time she had been there in 14 months, and set out the bucket. She did it again 3 days later, and again after that. The fourth time she went to fill it, the bucket was in the root bowl. In the spot between the roots, in the same orientation it had always been left. She does not know exactly which night the creature returned to the corner tree. She stood there in the January cold and looked at the empty container in its correct spot and stayed there for a while before she went back to the house. She has filled the bucket every few days since. The hollow returned to the quiet of the previous 65 years. The Game Commission received no further calls from that stretch of road. The trail runner on the ridge road east of the hollow has not posted anything since that July. The tracks in the mud along the Dry Fork bottom have not been photographed and posted again, or if they have been found, whoever found them said nothing about it publicly. The arrangement resumed, and the evidence of what happens without the arrangement was not repeated. Les died in April of 2022. Heart failure in his sleep. At 77, his children came from Elkins and Morganstown to handle the estate. They are good people who came to Tucker County to deal with their father's property, not to inherit his obligations. Irene told them the practical outline when they asked about a feed container they found at the fence line. She said their father had been helping with something on her property and she had taken it back over. They thanked her and moved on. Les's granddaughter is more present at the property now and knows enough to help when Irene needs it, though the full version she carries is the outline rather than the complete account. Audrey holds the complete account and has held it for more than 25 years. She has had that time to settle into what it means, to find the place in her understanding of the world where something like this fits, or at least occupies a defined space without continuing to disturb everything around it. She says she thinks about the arrangement not as something she inherited from her neighbors, but as something she is party to in her own right. She has seen the creature. She watched it at the porch steps in that brutal January darkness of 2014. She has maintained her part of the feeding schedule when Irene has needed her to. The knowledge is not a burden she carries reluctantly. It is a fact about the place she lives, the same way the geology is a fact and the climate is a fact. Irene's son-in-law still lives in the hollow with her daughter. He has not seen the creature again since the Tuesday evening on Route 72 in October of 2017. He has not asked about the bucket. Irene says he has reached the quiet accommodation that some people reach when they understand, at least in outline, what is happening around them, and decide that active participation in knowing more than they already know is not something they need. Some knowledge settles in without being formally transferred. He tends his half of a relationship he cannot name by staying inside after dark and not asking questions, and that is enough. What the counties around the upper Cheat River drainage do not have, on any official document or in any agency database, is a record of what has lived in that hollow for 3 generations. The West Virginia Division of Natural Resources maintains population records for black bear, white-tailed deer, wild turkey, and the other species whose management the agency's regulations address. They have no record for an unclassified large predator in the Dry Fork drainage. No form exists for it. The database has no field for it. If Irene called the DNR tomorrow and described what she has maintained for 50 years, the conversation would end in one of 2 ways. They would conclude she had been feeding a large feral dog or a black bear, or they would send someone who came back to Parsons with something they had no framework for processing. Either outcome would be worse than silence. So the official record is silence, and the silence is the record, and what it documents is the gap between what institutions can see and what is actually present in the landscapes they believe they manage. The question Irene has been thinking about for years is what happens to the arrangement after she is gone. She is in her late 60s and is healthy. She expects to be managing the corner tree for at least another decade. After that, she does not know. Of the 9 households in the hollow, 3 contain people who know enough about the arrangement to continue it if they choose to. Whether they will choose to, whether the knowledge will survive the transition from her generation to theirs in a form that carries the full weight of what the arrangement means, is the question she cannot answer. She has thought about writing it down. She has not been able to decide whether writing it down would preserve it or compromise it, whether the existence of a document would create risks that the oral version does not carry. She has not written it down. What the arrangement requires beyond the physical act of filling a bucket, is the understanding that gives the act its meaning. The creature is not coming to the corner tree because it is hungry. The Monongahela National Forest above the hollow supports deer and turkey and everything else a large predator requires. The creature that comes to the corner tree is not dependent on Irene's kitchen scraps for its survival. It is coming for the corner tree itself, the designated spot, the defined point in its territory where a relationship with the human inhabitants of this hollow has been acknowledged and renewed across more than 60 years. The food is the physical form of an understanding. When the understanding lapses, the food is what lapses. And what the creature notices is not the absence of calories, but the absence of the relationship. That is what Irene believes. She arrived at it slowly, over decades, and she holds it carefully. But 60-plus years of evidence from a single stable location is more than most people working in this field have access to, and the conclusion she draws from it has been supported by the 14 months of 2017 and 2018. When the arrangement stopped and the creature was no longer contained within the territory it had occupied quietly for 6 decades, and the world beyond the hollow began to see things at the edges of its awareness that it had no way to categorize. A dogman that has a stable arrangement with a community stays within the territory defined by that arrangement. A dogman without that arrangement moves until it finds new terms, and moving means being seen, and being seen by people without context means incidents, and incidents mean the kind of attention that tends to end badly for whatever drew it. Irene does not think of the arrangement as protecting the people of the hollow from the creature. She thinks of it as protecting the creature from the consequences of a world that does not know how to respond to what it is. The white oak at the south corner of her pasture has been dead for 15 years. The root system is still in the ground. The trunk is solid enough to carry what is placed at its base. It will stand a while longer. Every few evenings, before dark, someone walks 50 yards from the farmhouse and sets a metal bucket between the roots. In the morning, the bucket is in the root bowl. Same spot, same orientation. 65 years of that, and still. Her father figured out something in the summer of 1953 that no agency, no institution, no research program, and no government has managed to figure out in all the decades since. That the thing in that forest is territorial, intelligent, and capable of maintaining a relationship if a relationship is offered. He offered it with a bucket of kitchen scraps and an absence of hostility, and the thing on the other side of the arrangement has held up its end without exception for as long as anyone in that hollow has been alive to witness it. The world outside Tucker County, West Virginia, does not know this is happening. The Monongahela National Forest's wildlife management records for the Dry Fork drainage do not contain an entry for it. The county has no record of it. The state has no record of it. There are no papers in any file cabinet, and no fields in any database, and no forms in any filing system that account for what Irene maintains at the corner of her south pasture every few days, and what comes for it in the dark, and what is left in the morning, in the root bowl between the exposed roots of a dead white oak that keeps standing because there is still work for it to do. Whatever comes for that bucket is still coming. The hollow is still quiet, and the arrangement holds, because someone with 60 years of understanding what it means to hold it is still there, still walking the 50 yards from the back door to the corner tree in the evenings, still putting out what the corner tree is for. She does not know how much longer she will be there. She knows what happens when no one is left.